Okay, all right. All right. Okay, so I want to start on chapter 7 today. If anybody, I think you guys did. Anybody not take the test yet? Anybody missing taking the test? I think this class is everybody's taking it. So, and then yesterday I sent out a video with questions to kind of introduce this chapter. All right. If you haven't done that, I recommend that you watch that and answer the questions and submit them. Normally, pre-COVID, we would have done that the day before, and so you would have been forced to kind of watch it. So, because I'm going to reference back to that on periodically. So, this is the shortest chapter in the test. Maybe only the chapter that's shorter is chapter 1. And the reason it was kind of the overarching themes of the video yesterday is that in a lot of cases, African history is manipulated in certain cases. Or at certain times, the kind of traditions are more based on oral kind of storytelling than that. Remember I was telling you, like in chapter 1, what's the difference between prehistory and history? The evidence of what? Written documents, written records. All right, and so this is a chapter that, and again, a lot of times we're Americans. We're a big country. We don't really know a whole lot about it. We don't really care about geography and other cultures and stuff like that because we be in American because we knows we free. All right, but in the past, like there used to be these like. You guys don't watch TV anymore. Most of you guys watch the TikTok videos and you got your ham radios. I don't know what the kids are into. All right. But there used to be like this, there's a show, The Tonight Show. There's a guy named Jay Leno. He had a real big chin. He still does have a real big chin. He was apparently funny in the 70s at one point, but he would do this skit where he'd go out on the street and ask people to identify like places on a map. Like you have and he'd like, can you point out where like the United States is? And unfortunately, a lot of people didn't know that stuff, all right? And so, let's say I pulled up a map of the world, all right, hypothetically, and I asked you to identify where Africa is. Now, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to have you go up there and point, but maybe you could use me as like a guide. So, you know where Africa is. Yeah. Can you point me in a direction where I can point where Africa is?
All right, to the right, back. All right, to the right. One more. Keep going. One more. No, to the left. Right. Yep. Right.
Oh, good. Right. Yeah, that's right there. Yeah, that's Africa. All right. And you guys are aware, I don't want to insult your intelligence, but there are some people, and if you're one of them, just keep it to yourself. There are some people that think Africa is a country, right? Yeah. No, just keep it to yourself. We don't need nothing, all right? It's a continent, which is a larger landmass. It has about 54 independent countries, all right? Now, like when I was coming up in the education game back in the late 80s, when I took world history, my history teacher, he didn't even touch this chapter. That would have required him to stop calling football players up and squeezing them in the back of the neck. All right. So we got our priorities straight back in the late 80s. All right. But the thing is that this is like I said, this is a chapter that gets overlooked a lot of times. And it's unfortunate because, like in the video said, the one guy talked about how this is, if you subscribe to the theory of evolution, this is the origin of our species, right? But the one factor is that a lot of cases, a lot of these cultures, their histories get manipulated for example, if they don't have like kind of a written language, and also geography, all right? Geography plays a role. Africa is not monolithic. Like, for example, in Kenya alone, there's like something like 70 different ethnic groups that have been identified in Kenya, each with their own kind of distinct kind of language or dialect and kind of customs and such like that. So Africa's not all the same, and geography plays a role in that. So you have the Sahara Desert, which dominates the north, and that usually culturally kind of separates kind of what we call Arab Africa, which is Egypt and Libya and Algeria, Morocco, from sub-Saharan Africa, which tends to be more black, right? But you have in these locations, you have deserts, you have savannas, all right? Like right here in the middle in the Congo, you have a kind of a rainforest, but there's a lot of different kind of like resources there, natural resources and such. Like today, there's a major civil war that's been going on for years in the Congo to a point where it's not even in the news anymore. But there are, and it's multifaceted. There are kind of like it's a war over mainly resources, like things that you find in your cell phone, right? There's metals that are found like in the Congo that like are used for cell phone purposes, right? And so they're controlled by these various groups, and it gets very confusing. So in the West, it's hard to understand. We don't understand. There's all these different kind of ethnic groups, each with their different kind of agendas just within that civil war, and it's really tough to kind of get a grasp on. All right, and a lot of times, unfortunately, when Africa's in the news, it's usually kind of focusing on civil strife or famine and stuff like that. But there are cultures here that are rich cultures that are going to basically fund the wealth that's going to spark the Renaissance. All right, that are going to kind of provide for things that are going to kind of like benefit kind of like civilization as a whole. But you find a lot of these civilizations, though, that don't have a written kind of language, that we don't get their histories right. All right, one civilization that's kind of a prime example is the Nok, which is mainly in kind of present-day Nigeria, kind of central Nigeria. Nigeria is the largest populated country in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's also a major exporter of oil. One of the reasons why gas is like $2.50 here is that Nigeria is part of a cartel called OPEC. You ever heard of OPEC? It means Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It's like a lot of countries in the Middle East and then Venezuela, I think Norway and that. They determine how much oil, for the most part, is going to be in the marketplace. All right, one of the big factors. All right, and so Nigeria is a major kind of place that's been kind of like Shell Oil Company has essentially basically kind of monopolized the economy there for the most part. But there is a historian named Henry Louis Gates from Harvard who had a great kind of 7-part series on African history that he's claimed that we talked about the Hittites in Turkey, who are the first civilization to smelt and work iron, that there may have been iron kind of smelting occurring in central kind of like Africa roughly around the same time. All right. So what we do know about the Nok is left behind. There's a number of kind of iron kind of tools that are left behind. So we consider them the first in sub-Saharan Africa to probably work and smelt iron. And then also a lot of these kind of like terracotta statues. All right. But what we don't know is the names of their kings. We don't know their social structure and that, because these are one of the many cultures kind of in Africa that kind of use kind of they don't kind of document their histories in written history. All right, they use kind of oral traditions, and we'll talk about griots and kind of those kind of storytelling. That doesn't make them less civilized, all right, because they're working and smelting in their kind of a metal age culture. It's just that when we like in the beginning part of the 20th century, there was only 2 countries in Africa that were not colonized by Europeans. One was Ethiopia, which we'll talk about its early history today, and the other one is Liberia, which was founded by former slaves from the United States in the 1830s. The capital of Liberia is Monrovia, named after James Monroe. All these other countries were basically parceled off by Europeans to extract natural resources for industrialization. And in that process, they kind of manipulated a lot of the histories there. So what I'm doing with this is I'm going to kind of, there's a note. These are the terracotta statues that I was talking about. You'll find them like in various museums. Now, later, Pablo Picasso kind of delved into kind of African art. And there are some aspects of kind of Picasso's that are very much kind of like influenced by these. All right. So by making art as well, art just doesn't just happen. Like, people like we talked about like in Luxor Cave kind of expressing themselves, but art is an extension of kind of civilization, right? The ability to kind of basically kind of express oneself. So we're not totally sure who, they believe this is a person kind of riding on a horse or, whatever. And then this may be somebody that's associated with kind of royalty, but we're not totally sure because they didn't leave a written language behind. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide these civilizations up. The majority of these are historical civilizations. They have a written history. But their histories can be manipulated by geography. So today we'll talk about Eastern and Southern kind of civilizations. Tomorrow I'll talk about Western and West Africa. So the first one I want to talk about, I mentioned briefly in Chapter 2. We were going to talk about ancient Egypt. And that's the state of Kush, not that Kush, but a different Kush, sometimes referred to as Nubia as well. The kind of origins of this civilization is just south of Egypt in what the modern-day country of Sudan. All right. Now, much of the Kushites' early history was tied in with Egypt, either as a client state or basically being conquered by the Egyptians. all right, particularly during the New Kingdom period. And during the New Kingdom period, most of the slaves that worked in the gold mines in Upper Egypt came from Nubia. Now, there's some debate on whether the Egyptians put a racial context to slavery or not. That's still that's kind of debated. There's historians that claim that Nubians were strictly used in that because of geography, because they're mainly the location. But eventually, they're going to turn the table on the Egyptians. All right, so that's why they consider them the first major kingdom of sub-Saharan Africa. But they don't know it is that they're going to kind of essentially, by emulating Egyptian culture, they're going to kind of manipulate their own history to a certain extent. So this is a painting of Nubian slaves offering gold to a pharaoh. This was found in one of the tombs of the pharaohs. All right. And then, like the Egyptians, the Nubians, the Cushites built pyramids. There's actually more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt. Now, they're not the kind of size of the Great Pyramids, but they kind of dot the kind of the landscape there. This is a place called Meroe, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And what did the Egyptians use pyramids for? What's that? What did the Egyptians use pyramids for? Tombs, yeah, tombs of pharaohs. Same thing with the Cushites. All right. So the Cushites are going to emulate a lot of aspects of Egyptian culture. Then in the 7th century, a Cushite king by the name of Pianke, sometimes referred to as Pai, is going to conquer Upper Egypt and establish a capital, a city called Napata. This is what they refer to as the 25th dynasty. All right? And so this occurs during what they call the Third Illness or Intermediate period. And this was one of the first ones of the foreign dynasties that ruled at least parts of Egypt. All right. And so for about 94, 95 years, we had black pharaohs that were ruling in Upper Egypt based on the Napata. All right. They emulated, though, a lot of Egyptian culture. Pianke took an Egyptian pharaonic name. They worshiped the same deities. They wrote in a hieroglyphic script. All right. So later, when historians come to kind of like excavate a lot of these sites, they just assume they're Egyptian. But later, looking at kind of variances in language, written language, and certain other kind of excavated sites, they come to determine this is a different culture. They just emulated Egyptian culture, which was the best practices in that region. All right. So they unknowingly, all right, for posterity, manipulated their history just by kind of emulating kind of Egyptian culture a little bit. And I think it was like 6 or 7 years ago, National Geographic did a whole cover story called Black Pharaohs about Pianke and the Cushites and that. All right. And again, they controlled a lot of the gold mines in kind of Upper Egypt there. This is Pianke's tomb, which was in what was Napata, which is in northern Sudan. All right. And then around the 5th century or so, they moved their capital away. The Assyrians arrived, and historians like to give credit to the Cushites for maintaining Egyptian culture, particularly in Upper Egypt, because they were replaced by the Assyrians, who had no interest in maintaining Egyptian culture. They were conquerors. And after them was the Persians. And then it was the Ptolemies, the Greeks, who emulated some aspects of Egyptian culture. So if it wasn't for the Cushites maintaining this kind of connection to Egypt, some aspects of Egyptian culture may have been lost to history. All right. Then, like I said, in the 5th century, they moved to a kind of a city that's on the Nile, a little bit further down in Sudan, called Meroe. Meroe was a crossroads for trade between places like Upper Egypt and the Red Sea. All right. And there was trade in various things like cloth and iron and stuff like that. So it became very wealthy. At the same time, it drew a lot of different people, like the Romans. There was evidence of Romans, kind of with Greeks and Romans going on. However, you do make it a target for other groups to kind of want that place. So emerging kind of empire kind of emerges from the east that takes over. But Meroe kind of served as the de facto capital towards the tail end of the Kushite kingdom. And you'll see this prime example here at Meroe. This is a kind of Egyptian-style tomb that was built by the Cushites because they're emulating kind of Egyptian practices. And over here, just yards away, is a Greco-Roman structure. That was probably a temple. All right. So you see, it's a multicultural city. All right, which a lot of these cities are that are crossroads of trade and culture, if you will. All right. And then in the 3rd century A.D., all right, the last Kushite king by the name of Yesbo-Kehemani, and this is the only time I'm ever going to make you type this out. All right. Remember, can you survive without knowing the stuff that I teach? Absolutely. Every day I feel somebody's going to pull me out of this room and tell me I'm fired because this job is irrelevant. However, one of the deals is that once you're done with this class, before you turn in your Chromebook, get a flash drive, save all these notes, take it to a safety deposit box, and then when you're ready to have a family, you have an arsenal of names at your disposal. I wouldn't recommend, you do what you want. I'm not telling you what to do. But I wouldn't recommend naming your firstborn Yes-Bo-Ke-He-Mani. Maybe your 10th kid. But if you do name him Yes-Bo-Ke-He-Mani, you can just call him Manny. You don't need to like go through elaborate type of stuff. All right. So in the 3rd century, Yes-Bo-Ke-Mani, the Cushites are overthrown by a power that's emerging from the east, which has its origins in modern-day Ethiopia, and that's the state of Axum. All right, which is spelled a couple of ways. I can't remember which way your textbook spells it out, but the state of Axum has its origins in Ethiopia, in the northeast, right around the Horn there of Africa, in a little area called Eritrea. So in 300, they took over Meroe, and they become the dominant power in this region of Africa. They have a written language. There's a Semitic language, right, which is basically the foundation for the common language in Ethiopia. One of the common languages is Amharic, all right, which is a language that's very similar to Hebrew and Arabic. It's a Semitic language. We know in their language what they refer to their kings, Negus and Nagas, which meant king of kings, all right. And so this is roughly like to give you a kind of a contemporary concept. This is 8300. This is towards the tail end of the Roman Empire, right, which we had talked about before. So while kind of Rome is kind of going like, this beginning of the end of the Roman Empire here, this is what's emerging here in this region. The state of Axum has kind of emerged as a dominant power. And so this is the area that we're talking about. All right. Meroe, you see right there, right on the Nile. And at one point, they even extended control into Arabia. So they had control technically into 2 continents, into Africa and into Asia. The founder of the empire, not necessarily the kingdom per se, but the empire, and the one who conquered Meroe was the Negus and Nagas by the name of Enza. Now, his stories are kind of outlined in numerous kind of histories, but also there's this thing called the Enza Stone, which talks about his conversion to Christianity. The story was that his father, who was Negus and Nagas, took in these 2 children who were shipwrecked. They were probably from Syria, who were Christians, who taught Enza about Christianity. All right. And so after taking over Meroe and basically governing a large kind of area of land, much like how the Emperor Constantine in Rome, he decided to turn to Christianity as a unifying factor. All right. And so still to this day, Ethiopia considers itself one of the oldest Christian churches in the world. There is something called the Ethiopian Coptic Church. All right. And so this predates the Roman Catholic Church. Maybe the only other church that predates the Ethiopian Coptic Church would be the Armenian Apostolic Church in the Caucasus there. All right. And so Enza is, and this later, we talked about Islam last chapter. Much later, 300 years later, when the Prophet Muhammad and his followers fled to Medina. Before that, there was a number of Muhammad's followers who fled to Ethiopia. They were referred to as Abyssinia at the time. And so the story is that a group of Muslim persecutors from the Qurashi tribe in Mecca followed them to Ethiopia. And the Ethiopian Negus and Nagas at the time basically told them, no, we're not going to give these people up. So later, when the Prophet Muhammad, when they were talking about proselytizing, basically converting to Islam, the Prophet Muhammad was quoted as saying, do not proselytize to the Abyssinians, the Ethiopians, the Axum, for they gave us refuge. All right? And that's why today Ethiopia is primarily a Christian country surrounded by Muslim nations. All right. And then there's a kind of a park there that has the kind of tombs of a number of these Negus and Nagasas, where in front of them are these pillars called stelaes, which mark the kind of the tombs there. They look very similar to what Egyptian structures. Obelisk, right? Okay. See this one had fallen there from an earthquake. This is the one that's Enza's there. And like an obelisk, they would have inscriptions of the various kings. In the 1930s, Benito Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, took it over. That was one of the reasons why the League of Nations fell apart. It was after, though, the Ethiopians basically held off in the 1800s against the Italians. Hope nobody is offended by this who's Italian descent, but I had a professor in college who said, if you want to see the shortest history and list in world history, it's a list of Italian war heroes in the 20th century. He claimed that Mussolini, after conquering Ethiopia, took a number of these stelaes back with him to Italy. The reason being is, remember I was telling you, there's more Egyptian obelisks in Rome, the city of Rome, than there is the entire country of Egypt, because Roman emperors would take those back as souvenirs. Mussolini fancied himself as like a modern-day Roman emperor, so he did the same. Just about 6 years ago, the Ethiopian government, the Italian government agreed to have some of those returned. So this is in a park just outside of Axum there. And then later, after the Axum Empire kind of fell apart, there was these kind of smaller kingdoms emerged. One of them was called the Zagwe, and they had a king in the 13th century, in the 1200s, by the name of Lalibela, all right, who basically wanted, after Jerusalem fell to the Muslims again in one of the Crusades, wanted to recreate the city of Jerusalem. So what he did was he had a number of these churches built. This one's called the Church of St. George. They're basically built into a mountain. These are no bricks. This is just chiseled stone. Into this church here. This is the top of the church, just to give you kind of an idea. And so on Thursday, I'm going to show a video from 60 Minutes. I'm not going to give you guys notes. I'm just going to give you guys a worksheet that's like talks about the various cultures that we'll talk about. And then I'm going to show this video that talks about the churches of Lalibela and the structures. And they're pretty impressive. But like I said, there's a connection to kind of Jerusalem and Judaism and stuff from that. Matter of fact, roughly around the same time, Lalibela, apparently there's a church called the Church of St. Mary of Zion. And here there's a chapel that's on the church grounds that dates back to Lalibela, that claims to have, that it holds the Ark of the Covenant. You guys know what the Ark of the Covenant is? What's that?
From Indiana Jones.
It's from Indiana Jones, right? And so that's what made the Nazis' faces all melt like wax candles, right? You know what's in there? Oops, sorry. You know what's in there? The Ten Commandments. Okay, so the Ethiopian Coptic Church claims that the Ten Commandments are in this building here. The problem is that we can't get it. The only person that's allowed there is one Ethiopian Coptic priest at a time, and it's kind of heavily guarded. But there's later, when you talk about the Ethiopians, like the modern day country of Ethiopia, the line of kings that stretch through Haile Selassie, the line of Zion, that they claim that their lineage dates back to King Solomon, all right, who was the last king of ancient United Israel. All right, so there's a connection with it. So Judaism and Christianity. Now a little bit further to the south, and this was mentioned in the video, is a culture that's still vibrant today, called Swahili. All right, and so for most of the kind of the history of and Swahili is a language. It's a mix of Bantu or African dialects and Arabic, all right, with some Portuguese thrown in there. All right, it's the lingua franca of basically stretching from Mogadishu in the north all the way down to Mozambique in the south. All right, and so with this we see the introduction of Islam. All right, so you guys know some Swahili without really even realizing it. If you guys ever watched The Lion King when you're kids, yeah, like Hakuna Matata, that's a Swahili term. All right. Anyone buy Yeezys? Anybody got any Yeezys on them? Like $800 pair of shoes? No, man. Kanye West, Kanye's first name. That's a Swahili name. All right. So this is still a culture that's existing today. All right. And so the kind of the golden age here, like the kind of the 1300s, we see kind of this mixing of these kind of like we have Arab, Muslim, and Black African kind of culture kind of mixing together. All right, and so this is the area that we're kind of talking about, like kind of stretching around here. All right, for the most part, they were like independent city-states that kind of shared cultural traits and such. All right, the golden age, like I said, 13th, 14th century, 12 into the 1300s. 3 city-states kind of came to dominate, like when it came to economics. That was Kilwa, which is in Tanzania, Mombasa in Kenya, and Mogadishu in modern-day Somalia. These were the 3 wealthiest cities. And what you had was black merchants, Swahili merchants, trading with Arabs, trading with Indians. There was even evidence of a Chinese admiral by the name of Zheng He, who basically brought back a giraffe from the Swahili coast to China during the Ming Dynasty. So this was an example of kind of a global network of trade, much like how the Silk Road was, but this was like using the ocean, the Indian Ocean, and using the monsoon winds there. So what ends up happening is a number of Swahili convert to Islam as a means to make connections to the Arab Muslim traders that were coming to the region. All right, and then there was another theory that it also kept them from being sold into slavery. All right, because Islam, you can't sell another Muslim into slavery. That was the idea. All right, and so this is kind of the heartland here of the Swahili coast. All right. Unfortunately, though, because of the pandemic that we know as the Black Death. That led to basically the decline of the kind of Swahili towns as far as kind of economic powerhouses. All right, but much of the gold that's going to fund the Renaissance either comes through Swahili merchants eventually or in West Africa. Now, probably the first kind of real, written documentation of the wealth that was in the Swahili coast comes from a Moroccan Berber Muslim by the name of Ibn Battuta, who was kind of like the Muslim world's Marco Polo. You guys ever heard of Marco Polo? Marco? I don't know where you're at. And so he traveled to places that Polo did. They didn't know each other. They didn't live exactly at the same time. There's a little bit of crossover the places that he traveled into, like China, for example. But Ibn Battuta went to West Africa. We'll talk about his, he goes to Timbuktu and Mali, and then travels to the three, kind of Mogadishu, Kilwa, Mombasa, in the Swahili coast. He compiled all his kind of travels into a story called Vila. All right, and so he shows, and then the map here. This is Ibn Battuta in green, and that's Marco Polo in red. So, here's his travel down here to the Swahili coast. Now, some of his kind of writings, though, are a little biased. The further south he got along the kind of Swahili coast, he was critical of the Swahili introducing kind of African customs into kind of Islamic traditions. The further north, where you would find more kind of Arab presence there, he was a little bit more praising of. All right, but again, it kind of shows a little bit of his biases. But he did talk about kind of the merchants' homes and the kind of Arabesque style of architecture there. The problem is, though, is that when the Swahili coast goes on the decline, these cities are on the decline, and the Europeans start to arrive, particularly the British, they accredit the Arab Muslims of building these cities, not Black Africans. All right, because they look very Arab. They use Arabic style architecture and such. And they're emulating those best practices. So much like what we talked about with the Kushites, they are unknowingly kind of opening the door for their histories to be kind of manipulated to a certain extent. The backbone of the trade along the Swahili coast, the kind of basically the main things that kind of traded the silk and the porcelain or the kind of the gold and the ivory, were these ships called dhows, which were able to kind of go into shallow water ports as well as deep sea oceans like the Indian Ocean. So these were this is how goods got back and forth along the Swahili coast there. All right, and so you would have these kind of transcendent all over the area. And in the video they showed there's a scene where they showed they were racing these dhows and stuff like that during a festival that commemorated the birthplace of the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad. This is an example of a dhow. All right, now. At one point, though, like I said, when the British arrive here, they start to give more credit to Arabs, particularly those who colonized the island of Zanzibar, which were initially from Oman, which is in kind of the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. Zanzibar, during the Golden Age, was kind of the jump-off point between the Arab and Swahili traders. All right. Eventually, that was colonized by a family from Oman, and then the head of the Muslim ruler of Zanzibar was referred to as the Sultan, all right, which we introduced that term last year. So what ends up happening here is that when the British arrive, they basically give more credit to the Arabs, those on Zanzibar, as a means to try to basically build a rail line in the eastern half of the continent there. All right, so they basically disregard the claims of Black Africans. All right, and so what they end up doing is they end up building a kind of a structure here called the House of Wonders for the Sultan himself. All right, today it's kind of abandoned. All right, and so that was a means to basically try to give an excuse to say that if we give you this, can we build a rail line? All right, probably the most famous of modern inhabitant of the island of Zanzibar is Freddie Mercury. You guys know who Freddie Mercury was? The lead singer Queen. His family was from India, right? But he was born on the island of Zanzibar. There were Zoroastrians or Parsis, if you will. All right. So this is in the video they talked about this, how this kind of introduction. While Islam is a unifying factor in many cases, it's also a divisive factor when it comes to kind of history, particularly after the Golden Age there. And then most of the wealth that was traded between the Swahili merchants and the Arab and Indian traders came from the interior, primarily from this place, Zimbabwe, which there's a modern-day country that takes its name from this ancient kingdom. All right. The name means great house of stone or big house of stone, depending on where you get your information from. This was rich in iron, but particularly gold and ivory. All right. And so the problem is though, Zimbabwe did not, the Shona culture, which kind of is the descendants of those at Zimbabwe, did not have a written kind of history. So did you guys anybody watch the video yesterday and the guy in the beginning who was talking about Mapungukwe, the Hill of the Jackal, that guy? He is of Afrikaner descent. Afrikaners are those who live in like South Africa that are descendants of Germans and Dutch that arrived in the continent in the 1800s. There was a claim that those people, those Afrikaners, the Europeans, and Black Africans arrived on the continent roughly at the same time. So they both had equal claim to the place, which is ridiculous to think about right now. All right. So they claim that Zimbabwe was built by the Queen of Sheba, anybody but Black Africans. All right. And so they were able to manipulate that. And then in 1890, there was a guy named Cecil Rhodes, who's a British industrialist, who basically took over the entire country, was given kind of free reign, and established the country of Rhodesia, which he named after himself. That was known, Zimbabwe, modern day country, was known as that until 1980, when the Black population gained primarily its independence. And it had a similar kind of racial kind of like a policy similar to apartheid in South Africa. I'll leave this up for tomorrow. I'll play just a little short, like kind of TED Ed video talking about who built Great Zimbabwe and stuff like that. And then we'll start talking about West Africa. Did you guys get that at home? Do you guys get that?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you want me back away from the camera?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll slowly back away from the camera.
I reckon that's good.
I reckon as well. All right, see you guys tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
That is Zach.